Hey woodworkers, wanted to talk about sanding, which is leading towards a conversation about finish preparation. So sanding is so important to what it is we're doing, although it is one of those things that's a necessary evil that we all typically just hate doing, which is probably well-founded. But it is so important, and we needed to discuss the right way and some things to consider. So I'm going to do things out of sequence here a little bit just to keep this going, but just regular water here. I want to get the surface wet, and I don't want to pour this water onto the surface, but I do want to apply this pretty liberally everywhere. For the purposes of this conversation, I'm just going to focus on the face of this board, but anywhere that I'm sanding, I'm going to apply this water on edges. If I'm finishing the other face of this board, I'll do the same on the other face. But again, this face is the one that I'm interested in. Regular water is great. Distilled water is also an option, but what I want to do is let this dry. So I'll talk about some other things, and then we'll get into the actual sanding stuff. All right, so having a space to do this is super critical, something that makes sense. So this is my bench. This is where I do all of my work for the most part when I'm not on a machine. And it works. It's at a good height for me. I feel like the work is relatively close to my sight lines. The thing that I added to this environment, though, are some low-level lights. And so with these, hopefully you can see the difference. I don't know if that's translated in the recording, but by having a low light or a raking light, I can start to really see where I'm standing, where I'm not, and addressing that. So instead of just having a light straight on top, I really do need to set the light opposite of where I'm standing to get a better understanding of what's happening. Okay, so we're going to set that aside, let that dry. What I was hoping to show is that there's a board here that has this nasty snipe from the planer. It's a better view. And this might be dramatic, but it kind of goes away without that appropriate light stuff. And I think we would probably be prone to seeing that, but I want to give every opportunity to catch any of these things prior to getting too far with the sanding process, or worse yet is if I apply a finish to it. All right, so I'm getting rid of this. So when I'm sanding material in preparation for application of finish, I need to know that I'm not creating more scratches on the bottom. So I'm up here sanding on the top. I could flip and rotate this piece, but whatever's on the bench, and this is why it's a good idea to not do any gluing up on your bench, because dry glue is the worst. Dried finish is probably second. So anyway, I have a barrier here. There's a couple of different options. This is just a silicone sheet. Those are pretty easily found. This stuff I love, and I have no idea what it's called anymore, but it's got this foam backing and kind of this really cool pattern. I think this is used for construction sites. It comes in 36-inch rolls or possibly larger. This gets rolled out, so when folks are coming in from the trades, they wear their boots, this doesn't damage the hardwood floor or tile for that matter. Anyway, if anybody knows what this stuff is called, please let me know, because I use this like crazy. So there's that. Then the other thing that I have, which is kind of crazy, and it's been with me for a while, as you can probably see, when they used to do web printing, they would have a blotter, which I don't really know what they do, but they would occasionally get rid of these things. And so I love this because it protects that surface from my bench. And so I use this all the time for preparing work to be finished and out the door. All right, so let's talk a little bit about sanding, which is something that I probably never thought I would be discussing, but here we are. All right, so why do we sand? So we need to prepare the surface area. And if we're looking at the face of this material, and this will happen typically on most faces, with machining, we're going to get some deep rhythmic gouges into this board. And I'm thinking mostly jointers and planers. So that's where this thing is cutting. If we're feeding this through machine in this direction or opposite, we're going to have these things that need to be removed. If we apply a finish straight to it, all of these are going to become highlighted in a really horrible way. So we need to remove that. If this were the edge that we can see here, table saw will make these nasty cuts here. We need to deal with that as well. Sanding is one way. Dragging a hand plane across this is another way. If we take this edge to the jointer, we're basically going to have this type of shape, but it's going to be closer to this type of a rhythm. So anyway, so we need to get rid of these guys right in there. So with sanding, it's a great option for getting into those deep areas. And let's say my target is going to be the low spots of these, and I need to sand and abrade those things. So let's just say this is kind of where this is going to take me with the sanding process. So in that, we start sanding. So sanding is not terribly new. It's not terribly novel. It's something that everybody has been doing for a very long time. Even when they were actually using sand, then glass, prior to the new materials that they're making sandpaper out of. But in essence, the process hasn't changed. We drag that abrasive over the surface, and with that, we start making some really deep scratches that almost get down, in theory, to our plane marks. All right, so sanding, 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 here we are. But now the problem is we've just kind of traded one problem for another. So we need to remove those little scallops that the jointer planer have made, and we drag sandpaper here across the board, and it should go without saying, we always sand in the direction of the grain, which I'll show you here shortly. So I've created some scratches here. Now, the lower the number, so let's say this blue corresponds with my first grit, depending on what it is you're sanding and how problematic this board is. If it's flat to begin with, maybe I don't need to start quite as aggressively, but I typically start with somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 grit paper. And there's also 80, and the lower the number, the more aggressive this stuff is. But 100 grit is kind of where I start on a flat board, like the ones that I had illustrated here earlier. So even with this nasty little snipe, I would drag sandpaper across here, which is probably 100 grit, and make short work of that. The other part of this is Douglas fir, so it's a softwood. If this were oak or pine or oak or ash or something, that would definitely tip the scale on this as well. All right, so I'm starting with 100 grit. I've gone over the surface. Now I need to get rid of these deep scratches that I've created, because I'm in the same boat. If I just create these scratches and then put a finish on it, then I've got all kinds of problems. It's just going to highlight all of those little areas, and in these little valleys here, finish is going to pool and collect and create a different reflection through the finish, and it's going to show up not in a pretty way. So, all right, so I have these deep scratches here. So I've created these high points between those little valleys. So the next grit that I'll use is going to be 120 grit. And then that grit is not going to cut as deep, but it's going to take out these high spots here and here. So doing this, all right, so the process here continues, and I will do this and continue to do this all the way up until I get to the point where this has become dead flat. And so I'm creating deeper scratches between these finer and finer points, and then in doing so, I'm actually allowing more of that wood to show through, because I don't have the difference like we had up here between a high spot and a low spot. Here we have the high spot and low spot, and then the green to carry this thing on. This is either 180 grits or a 220. So something like that. So I'll continue the process until I need to. If I got rid of all the scratches from the previous grit, then I'm successful, then I can move up to the next one. If there are still scratches, then I need to continue to work on whatever grit is going to remove that. And our eyes are only really perceptible to a certain level. Usually 220 is the grit that I'm comfortable being done with. And a lot of people talk about going up to finer and finer grits. Sometimes 400 grit comes into the conversation, and that's okay, but thinking about the fine points that we're making here, if we're sanding with the grain, I just don't know if there's a lot of benefit with that 400 grit. So I really think 220 is the sweet spot for what we're doing. Okay, so getting back into this conversation about where we started. So when I was applying the water onto this board, and I do this before I start sanding, so before 80 or before 100 grit, and I do it between every single step. So I'll do H2O here, H2O here, and so on and so forth. I just get into the habit of this, and there is one exception for when I don't introduce water into this material, and that has to do with how thick this material is. If I have a board that is 3/8 of an inch, it's right on the cusp of where I don't want to introduce any moisture. And even if I'm putting moisture on both faces, that's good. But then if the board is really thin, it doesn't have a lot of linear rigidity, then I can start to cup this board, start to twist, bowing. Any problem that you don't want to have happen, it can definitely happen if the board's too thin. Most of the material, if it's 3/4 of an inch, give or take, or greater, I'm going to slather this stuff up, again, within reason. I'm not going to just open the faucet on this thing. But what that does is that even with the scallops here, given the grain fibers, I'm going to start to raise the grain here prior to sanding. And by doing this, when I come back with my sanding block, let's say my sanding block is lovely orange, and then I drag this across, going with the grain, I start to cut these off so much faster because they're standing up. And then once I'm done with that grit, I'll re-wet, and again raises these guys up just a little bit, but it makes short work of the sanding process. You do have to wait for the wood to dry, and that's why I started with putting water on this thing first. If you wet sand solid wood, nothing good is going to happen with that. It's just going to clog the pores of the sandpaper, and it becomes a big mess. But it's not going to take long to dry. This board that I applied wood to is already dry, and we're ready to do the sanding. But this water trick, it saves me about 1/3 of the time that I would ordinarily have to do to sand. And like I said, this is not the favorite of any woodworker to do sanding, so this is kind of a shortcut that doesn't really negatively impact any part of the process. The other caveat that we should talk about is if your finish is going to be a water base or waterborne material, you have to do this process at some point. And people that are leading up to putting on a water finish, they recommend doing this water trick only once between your grits, and I've heard the recommendation that it should happen between 180 and 220 or 150 and 220, but it's between your last two sanding layers or coats. So anyway, I've just, like I said, I've had no problems with doing it between each one of these coats. If I do use water-based finishes, which I'm prone to do, love those. Even if I weren't, I would still be tempted to do this just because of the time factor. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful in talking about what this stuff does. So putting back my buddy. Okay, so in looking at this, I can feel that those little fibers have been elevated. And so I now need to go back in and flatten those things down. And we should talk about the sandpaper because that's what I'm going to be using. So two different flavors of sandpaper. I've got this gray paper, which is a wet dry paper, primarily based in a silicone carbide format. Not good at all for raw wood. This is good between coats of finish for roughening up and applying your next coat, but I would never use this on raw wood unless I absolutely had to, and then at that point I know those clogs or those pores are going to get clogged so quickly that this is going to be painful the entire process. Different color here. Aluminum oxide usually comes in this tan or lightish beige or whatever color this thing is. Anyway, different makeup of these things. It does great with solid wood with no finish on it because it cuts through these things with very little downside. The paper comes in a couple of different forms. So this, sandpaper has a scale in the States going anywhere from A, C, D, and E, and sometimes F. But A is the lightest paper weight that you can use, and a lot of times that's used for really light application stuff. Larger or thicker paper weight, which is what this stuff is, this is more in the C or D realm, and that's more for cabinet making applications, woodworking applications. That's what this stuff is. It holds up much better, and it doesn't tend to tear as you're doing your sanding. So just knowing about that is helpful. And most sandpapers themselves are truly on this paper backing. You can also get them with a heavier backing that is cloth based. A lot of the times on a belt sander, you'll find that this will just not be strong enough to hold up with the speed and that oval shape, and so this will start to fall apart almost immediately. But a heavier cloth backing would be fine for more machines and belt sandings. But anyway, paper is what we're after. Not all are created equal. And so just be aware of your supplier, read reviews, and go from there. But the thing that I have done, because usually I purchase sandpaper in a 9x11 sheet, and then I want to cut this in such a way that it will fit onto my sanding block. And a lot of people prefer to have manufactured sanding blocks, but I just have a layer of chipboard in here and then just gluing on 2 layers of 1/4-inch cork. And the cork has a tendency of kind of leveling out that surface because it has some give, and so that's great. So what I want to do is I want to cut this paper to fit on this block. If I were to wrap this whole thing around this, a lot of excess material here, and I'm also going to create some ridges in this paper, so it doesn't really work. So cutting this stuff down, basically you need to cut it in half twice or quarter this sheet. So I made this jig a while ago, and I read an article and I thought, yeah, that's brilliant, I'm going to do that. No regrets. So just took a hacksaw blade here and here. I think I would prefer to have a jointer knife here, but I know that any little bit of contact is going to cut me wide open. So hacksaw blades are pretty great for what we're doing. And the reason being is I could put this against the stop. I'm going the wrong way. Put this against the stop. And then I've got the sizes of these sheets that I need ready. A lot of people use scissors to cut these things, but marking and laying those things out just seems like it would take forever and be a bit of a bear. Okay, so that's how I prepare sandpaper. One other thing that I should talk about for sanding. So there's a bit of a love-hate between purists about these things. I love this thing, and I use it 90% of the time when I'm getting into sanding, especially if I'm doing flat work like this. I do a lot of shaping work or curved or funky shape stuff, so this one is maybe not as ideal for that. But this is a random orbital sander, and that's the only kind that I would recommend using. The kinds that have a square bottom, those are referred to as quarter sheet sanders, palm sanders, I've heard them referred to as well. Those leave really nasty swirl patterns inside of the wood. They're very, very small. They don't show up until you apply your finish on, and at that point you're in a really bad spot because the finish needs to go away, either by abrading it or getting on it right away with solvents, and it just becomes a big mess. So random orbital sander, yes. Unfortunately, there is a sander between the quarter sheet sander and this guy, and that looks exactly the same as this, but it's a lot cheaper, and it's just an orbital sander. So difference between a random orbital and an orbital is the orbital will rotate off of one center point here, and that rotation does the same thing that a quarter sheet sander does on the wood, and it creates these really fine little swirl patterns, and it's so horrible. The random orbital, yes, rotates, but it's not focused or fixated on one central point. It's eccentric, so there's a little gear in here that as this is rotating, it will start to cause different positions on the gear. And so that takes care of all those little swirl marks that you don't want to be involved with. So yes, buy one of those things. You will not regret it. If you do, you're crazy. But all right. So my board, as I said, I do need to do a little bit of touch up as the water has gone on. I can't apply a finish with this because it's just going to interfere and become a bit of a mess. So for this, I'm going to wrap this around tightly onto my sanding block. And what I'm looking for is no wrinkles, no bubbles. I really want to have a nice surface on this thing. And then same with the grain. I'm able to level those things out. I can go in either orientation here. Grain is no longer a factor. I just need to go with the grain and not really worry about where those fibers are coming up or down when I'm sanding. All right. If I were to sand across the grain, then all of those little scratches are going to show up, and definitely when you put a finish on, sometimes before. The other thing that I want to do before I'm ready to go to the next step, I should say this is 280 grit paper, and so this is my last step before I'm ready to start applying a finish. But if I've done this and I can sight down against that light to see if there's any irregularities, any shinier spots or deeper gouges, I'll just continue to sand here. But I did most of the work before I started recording, so I'm in good shape. Whenever doing sanding, we always need to consider not just the surface that we're going to see the broadest area, but these corners are especially prone to giving us trouble. Wood over time can in fact start to move, and if this starts to pull away a little bit on the corners, if you're running your finger over it, great, but you could grab a nasty splinter out of this thing. Pardon me, possibly. The other thing is cleaning and all, it would just start to pull these things out and become just a nuisance and a bit of a bear. So with the sanding block, I'm going to just knock down the corners of this material. And I'll do a couple of passes here until, as my old professor used to say, until this corner is nice and fast. If it's kind of a really sharp corner, you'll notice it and it's a little bit slower. But by easing those corners just a little bit, then you're able to be done with this process. The whole time I'm using the sanding block, I'm trying to keep it nice and flat in relationship to whatever surface it's making contact with. So even though I'm rounding this as I'm sanding, it's not raising up and starting to dish or create other problems. And I really only want to ease these corners at the very end. If I start doing this with an 80 grit or 100 grit, it's going to make such a deep chamfer or easing. It's just going to look out of place with everything else. But just a couple of quick swipes there. If I were finishing the other face, I'd do the same over here. But I do want to do the same treatment to these corners. Uh-oh. Sometimes I get very excited with my sanding. Okay, cool. Once that's there, then I am good and I'm ready to get rid of the sanding, clear this area up, and start getting ready to do some finishing. I think that was everything. Okay. Thanks, everyone.